item.
Oh, sa
Hey,
blind item.
bro, speaking of blind item, marami tayong blind item in the previous episode. Isa sa blind item ngayon, yung in-imply na behind a coup attempt against President Marcos Jr. Of course, in the Philippines, when the term coup comes in, you always have a mixed response, right? Because on one hand, it's like, coup na naman, gagamitin na naman yan to, shut down opposition, di ba? I mean, we had enough of the coup plot, weaponization during Duterte administration, di ba? Yung favorite natin, Oktoberfest. Ay, October Revolution. Di ba? Yung 2017, sabi nung isa, si Parlado ba yan? Sabi niya na,
Si Parla.
di ba, October. Sabi niya yung, di ba, yung Russian October Revolution, Bolshevik takeover. Tapos sabi nito, ano yung October? Baka Oktoberfest, di ba? Now, speaking of that, syempre daming blind item. Sino naman ang behind ano dyan? Of course, alam natin, I mean, logically, if there is discontent within the military, I mean, where is this coming from? And if ever there's anyone against BBM, I don't think it's the opposition anymore. It's those who are very unhappy because they didn't get the piece of pie they were expecting.
Right.
So, blind item. So this coup plot looks like a blind item talaga more
blind
than
item. Baka nga blind item. Okay. You know what I find really weird is like parang ito lang yung sense ko. I think this is a nothing burger. I really think it's a nothing burger. May nag-iingay dyan para manggulo. It's a nothing burger because if the military was angry, it was not at this administration. It was at the previous administration. Of course, on a very personal level, I'm sure may mas close kay Politico X, kay Politico Y, may mga colonel na mas close kay Politico X or Political Y. But so that's yung personal level. And there might be may personal na giraan dito, hindi ko alam. Pero if you zoom out, mag-macro ka lang, kanino ka pa magagalit kung ikaw military? The military is extremely pro-American and it's extremely anti-communist. Yung previous administration was not only willing to sell us out to China, it was also elected with the support of the Communist Party of the Philippines and then went on to appoint communist nominated cabinet secretaries to its government. And really played ball with the communists until, of course, it went on a hard right turn and started killing the communists because it was reacting to the military. So just in terms of kung kanino ba magagalit ang military, dito ba sa current or
blind
sa
item tayo, bro. Huwag natin pangalanan. Huwag natin pangalanan. Basta, may letter R doon, hindi Ronald Llamas. Sabi pa, baka hindi Kula Desma daw. Kula Desma. But at the same time, bro, so the other part of my answer is, of course, my no burger, hamburger. But, on the other hand, we have a history of coups, right? So many coups d'etats in Philippine history. And let's not forget, earlier this year, President Marcos Jr. had to step in and do some reshuffle in the military, diba? Because some people appointed by some other blind item people, blind item natin ulit, may in-appoint sila sa military na mukhang may ginagawang kalokohan daw, diba? So they had to do some reshuffle and all of that. Although, of course, the official excuse was, some of the appointments in the past kind of jumbled the hierarchical promotion, so we had to just rationalize it. But from what I hear, including from people who are serving at a very senior level in defense and military, was actually some mumbo jumbo was going on. So Marcos had to fix it. So at the same time, I cannot be totally dismissive about this because we do have a history of coup plots and all of that. So
ang coup talaga natin Marcos era, di ba? Of course, the biggest coup is really the autogolpe of 1972 because 1972, the declaration of martial law was a coup, actually, if you think about it. Pero it was a coup, it was an internal coup. In other words, Marcos used the military to destroy the administration he was leading and to create a new dictatorship, a new administration, which would be run by himself in the military. So that's actually a self-coup or in political science terms, autogolpe. That is still the biggest coup in our history, 1972.
That's very good way of putting it. And it was no less by a lawyer, a constitutional law specialist in a way, right? Which makes it very interesting. So let's talk about it, because if you look at the armed forces of the Philippines, it's the most American-trained military in the entire Indo-Pacific. I cannot think of any other country as influenced by America. Because, you can talk about Japan and Korea having US bases and all, but those countries already had their own military cultures. In the case of Japan, before they were colonized by the US. So they have a long history of having their own shogun and all of that. In the
Mm.
Philippines, really, the AFP arms, it's really an American, constructed institution. I'm not saying they're pro-American still, because I have a more nuanced take on that. I think they're more China skeptic than just blindly pro-American. But going back to this,
very similar to us actually. China skeptic, more China skeptic than pro-American actually.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I see it. Like, it's more I hate those guys than I love Americans, because yung mga Amerikano din minsan parang may swagger din sila eh. You know what, honestly, I was talking to some military people, mas gusto nilang kasama mga Australians kasi cool daw yung mga yan. And they're very nice. I mean, super cool. I'm not gonna say sino nagsabi sa akin, but pretty high level people say, ang sarap kausap yung mga Australians. Wala silang swagger. They're so fun to be around with. They bring you fancy stuff, but without the, pamukha sa. Yeah, ganito na lang. Kunyari,
pero what you're saying is yung baseline culture galing sa Amerikano.
Exactly. And speaking of that, and this is where Samuel Huntington, among other, comes in, right? Samuel Huntington was really one of his best books was The Soldier and the State, diba? I don't like his Clash of Civilization. We'll discuss that later in our next episode, as we discuss Middle East, etc. But one of his first books was The Soldier and the State, and he talked about civil-military relations and what makes democracy strong and what makes democracy stable is objective control by the civilian leadership over the military through constitutional order. The moment na yung military ay sumusunod lang dun sa tatay or nanay, hindi na siya military. Ano na siya?
Sa tatay, sa nanay, or sa inday?
Personal militia na yan, di ba? So,
sa tatay, sa nanay, pero wag sana sa inday, ha?
Yun lang ako nga pala, nanay, inday. Okay, wag tayo. Mamaya na inday, hanggang nanay, tatay muna tayo. O nga, no? That was a good entry. So, speaking of this, I would say compared to other Asian armed forces, the Philippines had the most exposure to this kind of professional objective control, right? Strategic culture that we inherited from. It's one of the few good things I think we got from the Americans, which is itong civil-military relations. No, I mean, of course, it was sometimes gray because of Mac Saysay, defense minister, working with who against who. I get it, but compared to our neighbors, speaking of Thailand, I think Thailand has had more constitutions and coups than they are months.
Or Indonesia.
Or Indonesia.
Indonesia, the Indonesian military has a duifungsi, or a double function. Exactly. So it's not just protection; it perceives itself as a guarantor of certain right-wing politics that are at the center of Indonesia. And in our previous episode, we talked about the 1965 mass killings, and that was because the military thought of itself as a guardian of certain principles of the republic, and therefore thought that it could just as a result could enable the killing of almost 1 million suspected communists. So I mean, compared to our neighbors, I think our military is pretty okay actually. Lalo na compared to the Indonesians. My God, historically Indonesians 1965 killings. Like, if that doesn't make you look down on the military, I don't know what.
I mean, of course, history of EJKs, there are many problems. I mean, we can talk about Palpara and so on and so forth, but the reality is we have to appreciate the Philippines within the Southeast Asian context.
Right? Within the South.
Thailand compared sa Indonesia, my goodness, genocidal yung ginawa nila sa Indonesia.
Thailand, Myanmar, Diyos ko, Myanmar, di ba? Parang, oh my God.
Ay, Myanmar talagang yun yung talaga. Yun yung talagang archetype. Horrible military. Even in the Middle East, bro, wala kang mahanap na ganun. Like, the genocidal, sabi nga naalala ko isa kasama natin, sabi nga, kung sino pang pangit, yung pa yung masama, di ba sa Myanmar, ang papangit ng mga, I mean, literally pangit sila. Like, have you seen that? Like, they're literally pangit, di ba? I mean, what's the name of...
Even in Thailand, the junta uncles are so pangit also, di ba?
Prayot, and... Pero at least medyo chubby yung isa, cute yung isa. Prayot kind of looks presentable enough. But look at the Myanmar one, bro. Di ba yung nickname nung head nila ngayon was something like cat shit? Something like that. Like, check it. Kasi mabaho daw siya, yung mga ganun. Like, bro, just look at their nicknames.
Yung atin, ano yung word na ginagamit? Matikas. May elemento na medyo
exactly.
matikas yung mga sundalo natin.
I forgot the Burmese term that used, but it kind of translates bad shit, right?
Bad shit versus matikas.
Yeah.
So, bakit nga ba may kasaysayan ng matikas? I mean, you're right, Richard. I mean, if you think about the PMA, I mean, you're from Baguio. I suspect you might have some attachment to the PMA. It's actually a great...
That's my second choice. If I didn't
It's actually a great institution. I mean, in a way, it does produce very professional soldiers. It's a great state college. It's a great state tertiary institution. We talk about the University of the Philippines a lot, but the PMA is a great tertiary. And like the University of the Philippines, it creates social mobility, because kung mahirap ka nakapasok ka sa PMA, makakapag-aral ka, and then you become a soldier, and after you're a soldier, you may not want to stay as a soldier, then you can do other things, right? And so it's a vehicle for social mobility, like the best state institutions. And then, they do teach you at the PMA the proper distinction between a civilian and a military person, right? So I think it's one of our great institutions, pagpugay sa ating mga mga PMAers. But that baseline culture, of course, can be corrupted. See, Ferdinand Marcos was the worst corrupter of that baseline culture. And I'd like, I've been very critical of Alfred McCoy recently, but his best book is actually called Closer Than Brothers, where he talks about how Marcos perverted the military. And 65, first term pa lang, and Ninoy Aquino was warning about this already. He was trying to create already what Aquino called the garrison state, diba? And the reason for that was, slowly yung mga people na rinirespeto yung distinction between civilian and the military, mostly PMA trained, tinatanggal ni Marcos slowly in his first term, or early retirement, or hindi pininopromote. Very subtle. And then yung mga nagra-rise up the ranks were non-PMAers, mostly mga galing ROTC programs, mostly Ilocano. I'm sorry, Richard. Promote. Of course, yung best example mo just si Fabian Ver. Fabian Ver is not a PMAer, di ba? Fabian Ver was essentially a lackey of Ferdinand Marcos, and that's why he got promoted. So that's how you corrupt the military, despite yung kind of baseline system of loyalty to democratic principles. And if you want to see how that's done, just read Closer Than Brothers. It's
so the argument essentially of McCoy is it's less about the collapse of professionalization of PMA trained people. It's more of the marginalization of the truly professional one in favor of their version of Bato. It's like, I mean, I don't know, like their own political loyalists for that matter.
Yeah. Well, si Fabian Ver, Bato de la Rosa is to Rodrigo Duterte as to Fabian Ver is to
exactly. So Ver was the original.
Iba lang doon, pulis yung isa, sundalo yung isa.
But except, of course, the Vers are also, I mean, there's a report that in the 18th century, there was a Don Fer or something like that. So actually, my old Spanish era elitang background ng mga Fabian Ver na yan. But ibang usapan na yan. So, because actually, I'm thinking of writing a book about Marcos, diba? I'm thinking about opening a scene in Batak, parang mga vignettes there, diba? So that's why I had to research about also the Fabian Ver and all of that background. But going back to this, but one element we didn't discuss, but we should discuss, and I think it's relevant also today, is the Cold War. Because today is the new Cold War, which I think is putting the Philippines, I mean, I see the Philippines like the Berlin of 1960s, 1950s, right? This is where the two giants are colliding. All of intel and counter-intel and sharp power and propaganda, everything's happening in the Philippines. This is the exciting part, this is the scary part. And the Philippine military is, of course, at the forefront of dealing with this. Now, during the Marcos time, the Cold War, right, really provided perhaps, I mean, to what degree was the Cold War a good excuse or a legitimate reason for Marcos to militarize the state or to objectivize his control over the military in order to more decisive deal? I mean, like radically from the center, right? But can we discuss that part too? Because our good friends, some of our good friends have written on that extensively.
Nakasusuportahan ka ng US kasi sasabihin mo lang this is an anti-communist effort, that's why I'm strengthening the military. So at that point, you could get away with yung problema with the Cold War was you could get away with anything if you style it as anti-communist, right? And then the US would be like, anti-communist, sige, suportado ka namin. So in a way, parang parang the US thinks of itself as so intelligent, pero actually during the Cold War, ang dali nilang utuin. Hari sila ng utu-uto.
That was my point sa Chile, na you're underestimating gano'ng mauto rin ng US for all their networks of intelligence and all. Nagre-rely din sila sa mga operator na indigenous informants. I think that's the pejorative term, di ba?
Uto sila. Parang mga mokong inuuto. Sasabihin mo lang anti-communist kayo, you get a free pass. Now, do those circumstances obtain today in this new Cold War? Gano'n ka uto-uto ang mga Amerikano? I mean, they did support the son of a dictator, but because he's anti-China, ostensibly anti-China, but he's not a dictator yet, like his father, and hopefully he'll never be a dictator.
Yeah. No, what I'm saying is that it's poignant in our time in a sense that the issue of how to deal with China, obviously it's a political issue, but the military is also front and center. And if there's anyone who's going to be creating trouble within the military to undermine BBM, obviously there's a China angle to that, right? It's hard to imagine this has nothing to do with China. In the past kasi, alam natin, yung panahon nila Trillanes is because of corruption, di ba? All of ano nangyari in the South. My sense is, yes, there are problems, institutional problems, but I think this is more geopolitical driven than ever, right? Than the typical trapo situation driving.
So bro, so kung ganun sa tingin mo, may entrada ang China sa military natin?
Not necessarily China, but their proxies, right? In favor of her...
Yung mga special envoy nila?
I don't know. I mean, so again, I'm really speaking out without any concrete evidence here. But my point is, if you look at the big picture, I won't be surprised if not this supposed coup plot, future coup plots could be one way or another related to broader competition between US and China, because Marcos keeps on going harder and harder, not only to American orbit, but even Japan right now is pushing for visiting forces agreement. Of course, they call it reciprocal access agreement, but we know what's going on there, right? So if you're pro-China, panic mode. Kanina lang may kaaway ako mga Frenchy lefty people na na reasonable yung mga take sa Middle East pero sobrang sabog sa Philippines. And they were saying, oh, Philippines is falling for Japanese militarism. Like, what? These are talking from Communist Party of China. Japanese militarism? Seriously, Japan did horrible things in Second World War. Absolutely, no question. But to talk about today's Japan as Japanese militarism,
ito na naman yung mga idea hindi nagbabago ang geopolitics. It's like yung mga Ricarte na naniniwala na yung US presence today is the same as the US presence in 1898. Itong mga to na naniniwala na yung Japanese presence today is the same Japanese presence as is in freaking 1940. I mean, it's just
But bro, this is the ultimate irony. It comes from the Makapili 2.0 club, right? The people who are attacking Japan today are a version of Makapili 2.0, right? And remember, the Makapili was Japan's way of, ruling the Philippines. But when I hear the words Japanese militarism, Western colonialism, it's like, yeah, that's a historical fact. But how is that relevant today compared to the bullying in your face that is happening on a daily basis sa West Philippine Sea? Yun yung mga sinasabi ko. At dyan talaga sobrang sabog itong mga argument ng mga iba dyan. Pero feeling ko itong guy na to nag-apply na for SMNI resident analyst. Ayan na. And hindi na nag-drop, di ba? Malapit na ma-appoint as foreign analyst for SMNI.
Oh my God.
Ayan. So, I don't know. I mean, ikaw bro, I mean, as I said, so I think we established that things are far from perfect. There was a lot of corruption of the military. But in fairness to the armed forces of the Philippines, especially during Pinoy's time, the Bayanihan program, General Bautista, a very good friend of ours, when he was the AFP chief, he pushed for really professionalization of the security sector, especially the military. Kaya nga, yung military ay hindi pumasok sa drug war ni Digong. How many times Digong asked the military to join him? They said no. How many times Digong said, take over, we want a military junta, magpapa-autogolpe siya? They said no. How many times he wanted to declare nationwide martial law?
Nationwide.
They said no. In fact, for me, the reason why he did not become a real dictator, he was more of a fake dictator, was because the military stood its ground. They were the who held the line.
Tapos I'm sure na tapos yung mga sundalo natin matitikas nababaduyan kay Digong because here he was like a town mayor going around military camps surreptitiously giving away Glocks to soldiers. Yung mga sundalo nang gagawin ko diyan, di ba? Baduyan sila dun sa presidente. So kasi hindi lang dahil maraming matikas talaga na sundalo. And this is a post-EDSA phenomenon. I think we're really still living in a post-EDSA society, even if a lot of its premises are crumbling. Kasi after EDSA, and you should read syempre yung mga trabaho ni Criselda Yabes, Boys in the Barracks. Because after the horrors of martial law, civil society, but also the military itself, invested in security sector reform. And it tried to revive yung old tradition ng pagkatikas ng ating military. And nakita naman natin during the post-martial law period na with the exception of crazy people like Palparan, ganyan mga mass murderers, that there really has been an improvement in our security sector since the Marcos period. And it's a steady improvement. And what they did during the time ni Digong was just proof that, in many ways, this is a much improved AFP.
And there's
And
also
personally,
institutional
ako
guilt.
talaga, I mean, I've been reading Patricia Evangelista's book. Great book, by the way. And ang kailangan ng security sector reform, hindi yung military, yung police. Yung police talaga yung brutalized sa Pilipinas hindi naman yung mga sundalo.
Of course, I didn't mention PNP for a good reason, right? Kasi mahabang usapan yan, di ba? But just to appreciate it, the Philippine military really stood its ground. It's true that some people got promoted. I think you already mentioned one of these persons under Digong for their political loyalty. Some of them really, went up very fast because of their Davao connection back in the day with Digong. But to say that the whole institution was compromised in the way that other institutions were brazenly compromised or self-compromised, I don't think that happened. I mean, just to give an example, so there's this very dark humor expression by the Supreme Court of Venezuela. No, this is 1997, 97, before Hugo Chavez goes all the way dictator, right? And they said something like, para evitar el asesinado, nos suicidamos. In order to avoid being assassinated, we committed suicide, right? So they preempted Chavez by voting in favor of a constitution that killed essentially their role as an independent institution, right? And we saw that happening right and left with Trapo politics. But the Philippine military was one of the very few institutions, aside from media, mainstream media, especially, from ABS-CBN to Rappler, us, in other channels. We really held our ground together. But this was really with the military. Kaya nga sabi ko, M&M military and media. That was what really held it together. If not for that M&M, tapos na usapan. 2017 pa lang yung time na nagko-call for total martial law si Digong nung panahon ng Mauten ISIS. That was the perfect opportunity for him to go all in, go Putin. He doesn't have the discipline and strength of Putin, but he could have easily gone there because all other institutions were folding right and left.
Yeah.
So M&M
matibay.
the
Matibay
military.
Maraming salamat talaga dun sa mga people who held their ground sa military ng panahon. It was a really scary period. Of course, ang hirap because on the other hand, ayaw mo rin namang i-praise completely yung military because meron pa rin mga problema. Like, sabi natin palparan.
Palparan, di ba?
Ayun talaga yung vicious violent anti-communism is still sometimes really scary. I mean, I am an anti-communist, but I like to think of myself as a peaceful anti-communist. Pero meron talagang anti-communist stream sa military na nakakatakot, na patayan talaga, ubusan ng lahi. Meron pa rin yun And I think at this point, they should just give it up because they're the ones who know. They know firsthand na mahina na ang Communist Party. Okay? They know it firsthand. They've seen the collapse of the bases. They've seen the deaths of the leaders. So itong klaseng politics of like, merong aktivista na arestuhin mo or i-disappear mo because suspected communist kanya. Parang bakit pa? Ang hina-hina na ng kalaban It's just, I think a lot of it is just paranoia. So that's really the main problem of the military. I'm not even going to say the entire military, but certain elements of the military.
But then again, bro, just to push back a little bit.
Yung Cold War era violent anti-communism, which like, just give it up, guys. It's
so
bad.
Ito yung analog nung mga leftists na caught in 1960s. Meron din yung mga proto-fascists na caught in the 1960s.
Oh, yes!
Fighting the wars of the 20th century, right? I mean, that's how I see it. That's a good point, no? Let me put it down.
Oo nga, no?
I always come up with this interesting, like when we talk, like this stuff come out. Very interesting, no?
Oo nga So, it's a theme for us, Richard, na we really, for various institutions, don't be stuck in the past. Kind of assess what the circumstances are today. And just because your kind of intellectual arsenal was formed, whatever, in the 1970s, doesn't mean you have to hold on to that. Madali, kaya naman Kaya naman natin magpalit ng isip.
That's a very good point. So just to end on this, so your sense is, so far ano lang yan? Marites lang yan. Kasi sabi naman nila Bronner, misquoted daw sila. But I don't know, I'm gonna... actually, Facebook friend ko si General Bronner. But I'm gonna check. But Marites lang ba yan? Yung mga coup plot na yan? Or do you fear that the whole coup plot discussion can once again be weaponized? Or should we have a healthy skepticism vis-a-vis this kinds of...
Alam mo bro, ito lang. Bumaba man ang popularity niyan, this is still a majority president.
Yeah.
I mean, ayaw mong bumangga ng majority president. Wala ka pang midterm, babangga ka na ng majority president on the level of a coup. I mean, it's hard. Like Gloria Macapagal Arroyo was not a majority president. She was highly unpopular. And even against her, nahirapan sina Trillanes. Paano pa kaya ito? Di ba? Paano pa kaya ito?
So last point, just to balance, para lang I don't come off as like, oh, this guy's a fanboy in the military. No. I mean, we mentioned Palparan, we mentioned all of the Oktoberfest crazy stuff being said by some of the people there in the military before. But look at it, most of the coups happen under two women, right? What 90% of all coups were under two women. Isn't that a bit reflective of potentially some misogyny going on also there? Like if you're a male president and you have less to be
That's a
scared
great
of,
point.
right? So if we're gonna critique institutionally, I would say probably there was misogyny at play. Although of course you can also make an argument that Arroyo was extremely unpopular and Corazon Aquino was there in going through the process of transition. But again, no, if you look, so this is the argument that I think Cecilia, among others, also made. No, one reason you cannot fully blame Corazon Aquino for a lot of her shortcomings is that she was really never fully in control. The fact that there were 8 coups d'etats, including 2 that almost killed them, one of them left bullet in the neck of Pinoy until the last moment of his life, just tells you that she was never really fully in control. And that's why she was never really in a position to push for the structural radical reforms that we all wished for, and I think were very essential to the survival and thriving of the EDSA regime. So I just feel that we have reasons to be critical of many shortcomings during the transition period, but let's not forget, I'm not sure Corazon Aquino was really fully in charge of the state until late 1980s. So essentially in the latter twilight years of her reign. So she really had few years where she was fully
the first pro Marcos, the first post Marcos to have control over the majority of the levers of state was really Fidel Ramos.
So a military guy really
Cory Aquino was really she was a transitional president, and you have to assess her based on the quality of the transition, which was okay. She was okay as a transitional president. She was solid as a transitional president.
Yes, I think that's one of the biggest explanation why the transition period was hilaw in terms of pushing for structural reform. Because let's say in the case of Portugal, right? The Carnations, the military itself was for democratic transition. While in the case of Marcos, it was not really, I mean, the RAM movement was not really for democracy. It was factional intra-elite warfare, right? This was about Imelda versus who is still around as a legal advisor of Marcos Jr., right? So that's the problem. I think a lot of analysis misses that. In fact, I had a conversation also with Teddy Casino, one of our good friends, of course, who will have very different opinion on a lot of things we have said, including on the military. I'm sure he's far more critical on them for his own reason, good reasons. And then he said, in fairness, if you look at Corazon Aquino, ipit siya eh. Ipit siya sa gitna ng military RAM, ipit siya sa gitna ng mga trapo, or ipit siya sa gitna ng mga feckless liberals. And then at the same time, you have these leftists like him were pushing for genuine reform, and eventually she just
that's a very magnanimous. I must say, that's a very magnanimous point from Teddy Casino, given that Bayan was actually really targeted by Cory's military at one point. So for him to say that is well, I mean, I think it's fair.
Teddy, I think didn't spell it out that way. I'm sure if you ask him now, he'll say no. But during the conversation, I brought out the civil-military relations part. I didn't see pushback from him. If anything, I think he appreciated also that angle, and it's thanks to Cecilia. I think Cecilia was one of the persons who mentioned that because she studied Latin America, Brazil, whatever. So she knows civil-military relations very well. And she was, I think, one of the few guests we have had who openly mentioned that. And I said, like, oh nga, no. So suddenly, yung pagka-critical ko dun sa kakulangan at saka yung hilaw ng reforms during Corazon Aquino, I suddenly began to put it into context, right?
There's a great article na lumang article ni Mark Thompson, si paring Mark, which was it's called Off the Endangered Species List, and it was after the 92 election, where he made the argument na just the fact na nagkaroon ng democratic election noong 92 already means na successful na si Cory. Dun lang, just on that level, may successful transition ka na.
Except almost mga Marcoses. I mean, kung nagsama si Danting and Imelda, they would have been democratically elected and brought back to power. That was close.
And that would have been scarier than Bongbong now. Kasi at that, kung nanalo sila noon, pa yun, empowered pa yun to return to the good old ways. Bongbong is actually good old ways in quotes. Bongbong is actually very afraid to do that, di ba? Parang that's why, parang rhetorically and also in terms of policies, distancing himself from the excesses of his father.
Na-marinate siya. It's like democratically marinated. On that note,
that's a great word. Yeah.
Di ba parang
Democratically
na-marinate siya
marinated Marcos.
ayusin na natin to, di ba? So, kaya nga medyo, soft, nice, and Anyway, before I get bashed a lot, just to be clear, I was just talking about comparatively, because this is a show on this is Nexus. This is a show about comparisons, the specters of comparison. So if you look at Thailand, you look at the genocidal situation in Indonesia, you look at Myanmar, which is essentially like the archetype of a horrible military and junta, that makes the AFP actually look at far more, professional military. But at the same time, we have to also admit that there were many things that went wrong. And one thing I didn't mention a while ago is that if you talk to a lot of people, I remember interviewing Lorenzana for a New York Times piece. Actually, the title was Not Duterte's Personal Army. He said something like, we are going to make sure this is not like the martial law in 1972. So there's that institutional memory and guilt, right?
Marcos had a Praetorian, like Anderson, Ben Anderson called the AFP Marcos's Praetorian Guard. They were not Duterte's Praetorian Guard. The police was Duterte's Praetorian Guard.
Which is the dual function, the Indonesian Praetorianism, right? Of course, we can talk about Turkey also and other similar cases. But on that note, thank you very much, Leloy, for essentially saying Marites lang yung topic natin today. We did all of this historical comparative, and yet, the Marites lang yan. Wag natin seryosohin. Well, I hope it's just Marites. But you're right.
Ako rin.
Yeah, exactly. But, it looks like Marcos is, but you never know, right? That's the thing. Okay. On that note, thank you very much, Leloy. Now, next episode, we're going to talk about even something more fraught.